Is that open source AI model you're building your next big project on actually open source? Or are you unknowingly tangling yourself up in a web of legal restrictions, user caps, and hidden liabilities? If you think just downloading a model gives you the exact same freedoms you've always had with classic open source software, well, you might be in for a bit of a rude awakening.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive, high-stakes clash that's playing out across the tech industry right now. On one hand, we've got the classic open-source software licenses, the rock-solid, immutable legal foundations of the modern web. And on the other, this wild, chaotic new frontier of AI model contracts that tech giants love to heavily market as open. We're going to decode exactly what this shift means for you, your projects, and your legal risk.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the classic OSS benchmark, then decode the MIT license specifically. From there, we'll tackle the AI translation problem, look at open source versus open washing, and wrap up with an enterprise reality check. Let's get right into it.
All right, part one, the classic OSS benchmark, the gold standard of open source.
So at the heart of all this is the permissive license. It's built on this beautifully simple philosophy: maximum freedom, minimal conditions. Basically, it means you can use the code commercially, modify it, redistribute it, and crucially, you don't have to open source your own proprietary work in the process. It is the clean, totally trap-free legal foundation that literally built the modern web.
Moving on to part two, let's decode the MIT license, looking at its sheer simplicity and, well, its limits.
Ever wonder why the MIT license absolutely dominates software projects globally? Honestly, it boils down to this number: 200. The entire license is literally under 200 words. Think about that for a second. It's shorter than the user agreement for a smart toaster. That extreme brevity makes it incredibly frictionless. You just include the original copyright notice, and boom, you've got full permission to copy, merge, publish, and sell.
But here's the catch. MIT's biggest superpower, its simplicity, is also its biggest limit. It relies purely on copyright law, meaning there's no explicit patent grant. Compare that to its heavyweight sibling, Apache 2.0. Apache explicitly grants a patent license, and it actually terminates if a user initiates patent litigation. That explicit legal shield right there, that's exactly why Apache is the standard benchmark for cautious enterprise procurement teams, while MIT remains the absolute darling of fast-moving developers.
Which brings us to part three, the AI translation problem. Code versus weights.
Now, this is where the friction really starts. Classic open source was designed for source code, right? Human-readable text, a clearly defined artifact with cut-and-dry copyright ownership. But AI model weights, they are a totally different beast. They're essentially just the compressed mathematical output of massive training runs. Because it's legally super fuzzy whether model weights even count as software under copyright law, AI vendors are just bypassing classic licenses entirely. Instead, they're using contract law, like your standard terms of use, to lock things down.
And because of this structural gap, trying to slap a classic license like MIT onto AI model weights creates a very specific vulnerability. Sure, the MIT license gives you total freedom over the copyright of those weights. But because it lacks that explicit patent grant we just talked about, users could theoretically face some serious legal exposure. Why? Well, because the hidden training methodologies or inference techniques embedded deep inside that compressed math might actually infringe on someone else's patent portfolio. It's a fascinating and kind of scary example of how a license perfectly designed for readable code just struggles to map cleanly onto the black box of AI.
Okay, part four, open source versus open washing, and the rise of the new custom licenses.
To fight back against all this confusion, the Open Source Initiative, or OSI, recently dropped the Open Source AI definition, laying out these 4 freedoms. Basically, for an AI system to truly be open source, you need the freedom to use, study, modify, and share the system for any purpose whatsoever. But here's the kicker. The OSI explicitly states that just dumping the model weights isn't enough. To genuinely exercise those freedoms, you need the source code used to train the system, plus detailed data information, so any skilled developer could actually understand how it was built.
Now, perfectly juxtaposing that 200-word simplicity and total freedom of the MIT license, we have this massive, massive number, 700 million. This represents the monthly active user cap embedded right inside Meta's Llama license. Meta markets Llama heavily as open source, right? But check this out. If your product is a huge hit and crosses 700 million users, the license suddenly converts. You're then required to beg Meta for a separate agreement, entirely at their sole discretion. That is what we call a field of use restriction, and it completely violates the first and fourth freedoms we just went over.
When we really look under the hood at these custom licenses from giants like Meta, Google, and NVIDIA, a pretty stark reality emerges. These aren't open-source licenses at all. They are dynamic, restrictive contracts. Take Google's Gemma. It forces you to pass down prohibited use policies to all your downstream users. Talk about a massive compliance and monitoring nightmare. And both Llama and NVIDIA outright ban you from using their outputs to train competing models. These are shifting, revocable restrictions. You would absolutely never see this kind of stuff in a classic, immutable MIT or Apache license.
Let's bring it all home with Part 5, the enterprise reality check, and why your procurement team actually cares about all this.
If you're building a commercial product, the risk profile becomes crystal clear when you look at it like this. Models like Qwen 3 and DeepSeek V4, they use true permissive licenses, Apache 2.0 and MIT, so they sit firmly in a low-risk category. No user caps, no surprise termination rights. But models like Gemma 3 and Llama 4, they introduce solid medium risk. Enterprise legal teams look at these custom contracts as unquantified contingent liabilities. Believe me, these are exactly the kinds of things that throw up massive red flags during fundraising or M&A due diligence.
So if your team is forced to navigate these custom contracts, following a checklist like this is absolutely critical. You've got to map your entire product roadmap against their acceptable use policies and figure out if you're somehow competing with the vendor. But honestly, look at step 4. If you can just choose an MIT or Apache license model right out of the gate, assuming it meets your performance needs, of course, you literally eliminate this entire class of legal overhead and friction right from the start.
And it's really important to note that even the OSI's strict new definition isn't settled law. It is hotly debated. The Free Software Foundation, for example, argues that the OSI is actually being way too lenient. They make the case that without access to the actual training data, not just the summary or information about it, you can't meaningfully modify an AI system at all, and therefore you just shouldn't call it open source. It's an incredibly complex balancing act between protecting copyrighted data and preserving true software freedom.
So I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. As AI models become exponentially more powerful and insanely expensive to train, will the frictionless 200-word elegance of true open-source licenses like MIT actually survive this new era, or are the tech giants' dynamic, restrictive custom contracts going to completely rewrite the rules of software freedom for the next generation? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining this explainer, and keep learning.